Good evening. I've been given the unenviable task of doing something on the state of democracy in about 10 minutes. How does one talk about such a grand experiment like Indian democracy in 10 minutes, particularly at such a critical juncture in its history? I'm not going to do a straightforward scorecard of the last 5 years, the gains and losses. I think over the last 2 days, you've heard a lot of deliberations on the significant challenges India has faced or not faced over the last 5 years. Everything from the architecture of social welfare schemes to the agriculture crisis to demonetization. I'm actually going to do something a little bit more abstract and talk about, I think, something we are not talking about enough when we draw up the scorecard of Indian democracy over the last 5 years. Right? One measure of the fact that I think Indian democracy is not just in crisis, but there is a deep, deep diminishing of hope at this juncture compared to 5 years ago or perhaps 10 years ago, is the following. The 2019 election is an election with very high stakes. Many would argue this is an election that is central to the survival of democracy, because if some balance of power is not restored in this democracy, democracy will be in peril. But the paradox is it's a very high stakes election, but it's also an election with very low expectations, right? What are the low expectations? Will our democracy survive? Will we muddle through the way we have over the last few years? All the big repositories of hope that we had accumulated over the last 10, 15 years. India is at the cusp of a structural transformation, right? India will, in a sense, reach a new stratosphere of growth and inclusion and job creation. I think all of those expectations have been deeply disappointed. So it's going to be an election of high expectations, high stakes, but very, very low expectations. And why is that the case? And this is really the one big point I want to make. Because I think there is something happening to our democracy which is mutilating what one might grandiosely call the democratic soul. Right? We are becoming a nation of resentful hearts, small minds, and constricted souls. In some senses, democracy should be an occasion for exuberance, lightness, freedom, gaiety, celebration, where one is heading is more important than where one comes from. Right? Instead, what is our democracy becoming? A throwback to the past. Right? So let's just very quickly look at what are we losing in this democracy? Okay? So I'm going to ask you a question. How many in this room think of themselves as nationalists? Put up your hand. Okay? Oh, not bad. Of those of you who put up your hand, how many of you have a certificate that can prove to me that you are a nationalist? Okay? So the first thing that has been taken away from us, right, is our own nationalism, right? Rather than the presumption that all of us are nationalists, this has become something we have to prove, right? Paradoxical, in an age of nationalism, nationalism is the very thing that has begun to divide us and mark us, okay? So, राष्ट्र गया आपके हाथ से, right? जितने भी राष्ट्रवाद की बात करें. Okay, let's move on to something else I'm sure you care about, truth. Right? It's true, all societies are marked by mendacity, propaganda. All regimes like to manipulate that gray zone between truth and falsehood. Right? All regimes, in a sense, like to create an environment which is propitious for them. It's true. Okay? But have you ever experienced a moment in the last 20 years in Indian democracy where the purpose of the production of knowledge was not truth, but something far more insidious? It was to relieve you of the burden of thinking altogether. Okay? It's not about falsehood. It's not about mendacity. It is about a structure of public discourse that relieves you of the burden of thinking. Don't ask questions. You're anti-national. Okay? So, Rashtra gaya, Satya gaya. Now let's come to that cornerstone of our democracy, this exuberant thing we call freedom. Right? Okay? Let's remind ourselves, there are still people in prison, Anand Tentulbe, Sudha Bhardwaj, or at least under the threat of prosecution, for serving marginalized communities in this country. It is true that no government in India across any political party has ever served the cause of civil liberties. You still cannot get the opposition parties to sign on to a new charter of civil liberties that will do away the law of sedition, that will at least reform, if not do away with Article 295 on the Indian Penal Code. Right? The act of speaking has become a dangerous act in a democracy. Right? So, freedom bhi gaya. Rashtra gaya, Satya gaya, Swatantrata gayi. Okay? Let's move on. The fourth pillar of the democracy, the free press, under whose auspices we are convened. There was a 19th century satirist, Maurice Joly, who actually envisaged a fantasy for what a democratic populist ruler would want of a press. Okay? I'm just reading out a description, and just ask yourself, who does it recognize you of? Who does it remind you of? So this is Napoleon III, right? Who thought he represented the people as a whole. He didn't need any representatives because all the people were in him. He says, my scheme envisions the neutrality of the press, the neutralizing of the press by the press itself. Because journalism wields great power, do you know what government will do? It will become like them. Government itself will become journalism incarnate. Like God Vishnu, my press will have 100 arms, and these arms will stretch out to every shade of opinion. Those who think they speak their own language will also be speaking my language. Those who think they are marching under the banner of their own ideas will also be marching under mine. I will be able to say I direct opinion at will on all questions of external and internal policy. I awaken the people's mind or lull them to sleep. I reassure them or confuse them. I plead for or against true and false. Okay? What does that remind you of? That ambition, right? Okay? So, press ki swatantrata gayi. Let's come to the final thing, religion, right? Okay? This canard, modern India, secular India, has marginalized Indian traditions. I think it has marginalized only those people who did not have confidence in Indian traditions. But, more seriously, we are at the cusp of a fundamental restructuring and transformation of the idea of religion in modern India in three respects, right? First of all, the idea of the mobilization of religion in the service of political power, where our most visible religious faces always begin by saluting the powers that be, right? That's the only mortal God that left. Second, the heresy and hubris of thinking that it is our job to protect our gods, not the God's job to protect us, right? And third, the idea that all religion needs to be co-opted into a single homogeneous power structure. Religion, the very thing that behooves us to transcend our identity, right, is being reduced to the identity that marks you, for which you will be targeted. Okay? So, dharam bhi gaya. Swatantrata gayi, rashtra gaya, satya gaya, dharam gaya, ajadi gayi. Right? Sabhyata. Right? What is civility? Societies are always uncivil in some respects, but the norms of civility are set by those who are in the highest positions of power. That's, in fact, their only job. Right? Their only job is to signal what can be said or what cannot be said, what is right or what is wrong. Right? But when those in highest positions of authority empower those who would threaten, intimidate, right? Those who would declare most of the people in this room anti-national, right? What is going to be left of civility? I can go on and on. So dharm gaya, rashtra gaya, sanstha gayi, sabhyata gayi. What is actually going to be left? Right? And I think if you want to draw up the scorecard of the last 5 years, I think the most important fact to focus on is that the last 5 years have been a mutilation of the Indian soul. Right? They stand for everything that is un-Indian. Right? They stand against every promise that this democracy gave to each one of its citizens. And so the challenge for us going to be now, and that's why I began by saying this is a low expectation elections, that no matter what the election result, right, unless there is a massive repudiation of the public culture that we have created in the last 5 years, in which many of us have been complicit in ways perhaps that we don't recognize, unless there is a massive repudiation of this public culture, you will not be able to recover either the nation or your freedom or your truth or your religion. That's what is going to be at stake in 2019. Thank you.
Pratap Bhanu Mehta is one of our leading public intellectuals. You've laid out over the last 13 minutes all that you think has gone wrong with India in the last 5 years. Is there anything you think has gone right with the India story as well? Or do you only see the negatives or comment only on the negatives?
The challenge is the shorter the time you give a speaker, the more the differences are accentuated, right? So, no, look, I think to put it in context, right? There is still great hope in Indian democracy. There is no question about it, right? I mean, this is why we are having this conversation, okay? But I think it's fair to say that over the last 5-10 years, it's not particular to this government, and that's why I don't think the issue is just confined to this government. The kind of transformative possibilities that we thought possible 10 years ago seem to be out of our grasp, right? India is at the cusp of so many fundamental transitions as we've heard over the last 2 days, right? Ask yourself the question, have we made the transition from crony capitalism to well-regulated markets? The answer is maybe a little bit here, a little bit there, but broadly no, right? Ask yourself the question. Right?
Can I ask you that question, Mr. Mehta?
Sure.
In terms of how assets were allocated earlier, which was completely ad hoc, to how assets are being allocated now through e-tendering and auction, there is a world of difference. See the work that the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code is. It's about whether you see a glass half empty or half full.
Sure.
There are multiple steps that we've taken on the issue that you just raised, of moving from completely discretionary allocation of assets to a far more transparent way of doing it, except that glass is still half empty and you don't see the part that's half full.
I think, Rahul, on this one in particular, I think the jury is still out on whether it's still half empty. In fact, as we speak, the IBC code is being undermined, as you know, in very many backhanded ways. The concentration, the fundamental test of corruption, right, is not transactional corruption. The concentration of plutocratic power in the Indian economy has not diminished. That is a fact. Okay? Can you think of any other major economy in the world with this much concentration of plutocratic power by a small group of actors across a very large number of critical sectors? That is what corruption actually is. Okay? We are not tackling that. You wanted good things, a lot of good things. I actually am a big votary of GST. I think the implementation of GST, I think, was flawed, deeply flawed. And to be fair to government, partly that those flaws was a product of the way it was negotiated with a lot of opposition
But look at where we'll be with GST 5 years from now. Sorry? Look at the road that's being traversed. Look at where we'll get with GST. how can you say that that doesn't make India a more open, more transparent economy?
No. Obviously, look, India is still a functioning democracy. India is still growing at 6.6% in the later quarters. Of course, things are functioning, right? I think the question is not, right, whether some things have, I mean, that's the low expectation bar you're setting, right? The question is whether given the mandate this government had and the majority it had, whether we lost the opportunity for creating fundamental transformations that would produce growth and jobs.
Mr. Mehta, the government never had your mandate, and therefore it's not the government's job to fulfill your expectations. The question is, for the people who voted for this government, do they believe that their expectations are being fulfilled? Your idea of India is not evolving in the way that you'd like. There are people out there who have an idea of India. Their idea of India is challenging your idea of India. That is what a democracy is. Let there be another alternate idea of India represented by the opposition. Let it compete and contest with this idea of India. Let the better idea win. Because your idea is losing doesn't mean, Mr. Mehta, that India is losing.
Of course. Rahul, what you said is a platitude. Of course, India is a context of different ideas of India. But any idea of India that puts its national unity at risk, that puts its fundamental constitutional values at risk, that puts individual freedom at risk, right? That creates a public culture, right? That divides citizen from citizen. If you want the defeat of that idea of India, sure, you're welcome to it. Okay? Absolutely, you're welcome to it, right? And of course, it is up to the people of India to decide whether this idea of India wins or some other idea of India wins. The beauty of this idea of India was, this was an idea of India that said we can live together despite our differences, right? This was an idea of India that did not say unity in diversity. It said we are diverse in our unities, right? This was an idea where you did not have to prove your patriotism. This was the idea that is actually giving the constitutional protections that you and I are talking about.
This was an idea of India, Mr. Mehta, that over a period of time got subverted to the extent that government started saying that minorities have the first right to the country's natural resources. An idea of India which got subverted in the sense that only certain areas started receiving electricity, whereas certain areas were not given electricity. Now, there is more rational allocation of all resources, which doesn't look at caste, which doesn't look at religion.
Rational allocation of, because yes, I think untransparent electoral bonds are very rational allocation of resources, right? If you want to talk of plutocracy, but in a sense, yes, nobody is holding a candle for the opposition party. As you know, all of us, right? All of us were at the forefront of saying that the old regime was collapsing on the weight of its own corruption, right? But look, you can call out the hypocrisy of liberals, but for God's sake, if you want to take down liberalism with it, then you are cutting your nose to spite, cutting your nose in spite of your face, right? Then you are basically saying what is important for us is to hurt certain people, not to defend certain values. By all means, look, throw all the liberals in the sea, get rid of that idea of India, absolutely no issue.
Sir,
right?
But nobody said anything about throwing liberals into the sea. We're just challenging the idea of what a liberal is and how can liberals decide that they're the only liberals.
That's what I'm saying. That's the wrong question. The idea is not what a liberal is. The idea is what values do you want to defend, right? When you say the idea of what a liberal is, that focuses on the hypocrisies of particular people, right? God knows, the ancient regime we had was a tissue of those hypocrisies, which is why it collapsed, right? Which is why it collapsed of its own failures and contradictions, right? But when you are throwing out that ancient regime, the question is, do you also want to throw out those ideas, right? That made this constitutional republic one of the grandest experiments in democracy in the modern world. That's the question. Throw out the Congress party also, but replace it with something better, not something worse.
Therein lies the greatest liberal failing. To come up with an idea which contests with an alternate idea that's being presented that is challenging the old idea of India, and now the liberal idea of India is falling under its own contradictions.
I'll tell you, the contradiction is not in the liberal idea of India. The elections are about a contest of credibility, right? And there I will be first to concede, as I've consistently done, that the credibility of all those people who claim to be bearer of those liberal ideas, right, actually wore thin. They were right, people were right to be suspicious of those people, right? But the question is, when you're suspicious of them, on what grounds are you suspicious? Are you suspicious because they don't uphold your ideals? Or are you suspicious because you want to tear down those ideals and replace them with something soul-stultifying and constricting? That's the question.
Soul constricting for whom is an idea that we leave for everyone who goes out and casts their vote. Whether we agree or whether we disagree, this is the intelligence exchange, and it is about the exchange of ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, at the India Today Conclave, can we have a warm round of applause for Pratap Bhanu Mehta? Thank you very much, sir.